Hello, hello, and welcome to this new episode of Leninhawk Talk. And whether you're returning or this is your first time listening, welcome. I hope you enjoy your time here. So today's topic is going to be PG-13 horror films, and this is largely because this past weekend, for when I'm recording, we had one open that was a little bit of a cultural blip and made quite a healthy little profit, and that is, of course, M3gan, or M3gan, whatever you want to call it based on how the title is formalized. So M3gan was originally filmed to be an R-rated movie. There was even some blood splatter in some of the trailers and all of that stuff. However, once the trailer dropped, because the M3gan robot does a little dance, it ended up sort of blowing up on TikTok and with social media that is aimed at sort of a younger audience. Think your 14, 15-year-old girls, that sort of thing. So it seems like at that point, the producers of this film decided that they were going to re-edit and reshoot some scenes to garner a PG-13 rating so they could get some of the business from some of the under-17 audience. That ended up making this thing go explode on the web after that trailer. I mean, right now we're in sort of a weird place when it comes to movie marketing. A lot of people have cut the cord and just have streamers, so they don't see commercials for when movies are coming out. If they don't go to the movies as often as someone like myself does, or if you're listening to this, probably you, then they don't always see all of the trailers for everything that's coming out in the next 3-4 months like we would, nor would they follow or anticipate the drops of trailers coming on YouTube, things like that. So... And we're way past the day where people would open up the newspaper to see the show times. So a lot of people don't know when a movie's coming out, and it's harder for movie marketers and the studio's marketing departments to reach anyone who's not a already tuned-in frequent moviegoer. So when something like this happens, they drop a trailer, sure, like they're going to, and it suddenly becomes GIFed and memed and all of that stuff. They felt that they had to sort of steer into the skid and alter this movie to get that PG-13 rating. Now, the PG-13 rating, of course, does help in some cases with business, because if you have an R-rated film, then supposedly no one under 17 is going to be able to see that movie without a parent or adult guardian. And if they happen to sneak into that movie, they're buying a ticket for another movie. In this case, maybe it would have been like Avatar or Black Panther at this time. And then they go and they sneak in, but the money still goes to the box office receipts of whatever movie they bought the ticket for, not the movie they actually watched, which doesn't help that movie's box office. I guess it might be harder these days for kids to sneak into a movie now that we're in the age of assigned seating at theaters, but probably not impossible unless it's a completely sold-out show. So they made the business decision, and it paid off, because the movie opened at $30 million when it was projected to open at anywhere between 17 and 20 based on the pre-release tracking. Now, this was the biggest opening for an original film, so not a sequel or based on a pre-existing IP, since Nope, which sort of was built on the back of Jordan Peele's name. And I believe it's about on par, give or take a couple million, with the opening of Scream 5 back in January of last year. So it definitely succeeded because it was able to get that extra business. Now, from a business standpoint, and also from a theater standpoint, having worked at a theater and been a manager of a Regal for a while, there's no practical difference between G, PG, and PG-13. You're not going to get carded, and they're going to let you in the theater. Technically, the age in which a theater stops charging for a child ticket and starts charging for an adult ticket, which is usually about the age of 11, at least it was at my theater, that should technically be the cutoff for PG-13 without a parent or adult guardian with you. But, if you're claiming you're 11 and you're 9 and you just look old, how are they going to know? There's no card you'd carry with you. So there's no real difference there. There's basically R and there's nothing, because NC-17, by all practical concerns, does not exist. Even with Terrifier 2 coming out in theaters unrated, it's pretty much just R and not R when it comes to movies coming out. So you basically have a wide open array of audience that can pay for a ticket and go view your movie. So there's been some issues here, because if you're like me, then you're probably saying, hey, David, PG-13 horror movies almost always suck. Like 99% of the times they suck. Now, this did cause a kerfuffle, because when M3gan got the PG-13 rating, people were complaining about it, and people who liked that original trailer and were excited to see the movie, like I did, had second thoughts when we saw the PG-13 rating, because it's like, groan. But there was some pops of, I guess, backlash to that backlash. So there were people online, for one, Michael Kennedy, who's probably best known for writing and directing Freaky, the body swap slasher movie that was released November of 2020, so pre-vaccine, so it didn't do too well in theaters. I think it popped later on streaming and physical media, though, and it became half of a haunted house at Halloween Horror Nights last year. He had a couple different tweets. On January 5th, he tweeted, like in quotes, PG-13 horror is stupid. I guess attacking people like myself who would say that. And then he just said in all caps, then it wasn't made for you, bitch. That he may have an argument there. A PG-13 horror movie may not be aimed at an adult audience. It may actually just be aimed at the teenage audience that rating is specified for. But since the movie in question people were bitching about is M3gan was made for the adult audience. It was then Frankensteined into a PG-13 movie through edits and, self-imposed censorship and in reshoots. So it was initially made for an adult audience and then was transformed into something for a wider audience. He also said something. This one rubbed me the wrong way, because I think it's conflating two different groups of people. He wrote, PG-13 horror is great because it creates a new horror fan to replace each whiny pud crying about horror being quote-unquote woke. Now, I'm not sure why he's equating the annoying right-wing chuds who complain about movies being quote-unquote woke just because they're not sticking to just white male cis bullshit. The people who are complaining about PG-13 horror are people like me who realize that most of these movies suck. And we'll go into exceptions in a bit. I think that's a different audience than people who are like, I don't like that superhero movie because it's based on a female superhero. Those are like two completely different groups of people with different grievances. And I would argue that the people not liking PG-13 horror have, not empirical because taste is relative, but have much more of a leg to stand on than people who are like, oh, I don't like liberal politics in movies. I think he's conflating two different groups. There may be some overlap in the Venn diagram. I'm sure, right-wing pieces of shit probably also don't like PG-13 horror movies, but probably for a different reason. So that rubbed me the wrong way, but, Michael Kennedy, he made a very good movie with Freaky. I thought Freaky was a good movie. So, let him complain there. But then Fangoria jumped in, and Fangoria had a list of, I saw 3 tweets at least, and they basically said, like, once again, people are complaining about PG-13 horror movies and emoji, and then, anyway, here's a list of some PG-13 horror movies. And the implication is that, hey, this is a list of good PG-13 horror movies, so we shouldn't complain that all PG-13 horror movies are bad. And I'm not sure anyone's saying all PG-13 horror movies are bad, but I think what we are saying is most PG-13 horror movies are bad. And so cherry-picking a list of good ones, or at least what Fangoria says are good ones, I'll dive into the list in a little bit, doesn't prove that there's no issue with this rating. And the issue, what I like to say is, the first thing people come back with when you say most PG-13 horror movies suck is, one, they'll list a movie that is PG-13 in horror and is good, as if a few examples don't outweigh the many, many more examples of bad ones. But the other thing they'll say is like, oh, well, you just like gore, or you just like blood, or you just like the carnage candy, but a movie can be scary or whatever without that. But what they don't seem to realize is that the MPA, they are not just looking for that when it comes to PG-13 versus R for a horror movie. I think there was somebody had posted an article. It was James Wan being interviewed about The Conjuring, which he thought would get a PG-13 because it's not particularly gory, apparently. I've never seen it because of my issues with the Warrens. But they had come back and basically said, like, there's nothing you can really cut. It's just kind of the vibe is too scary. So you can get an R rating because the music is too scary or something like arbitrary like that. So if they're giving something a PG-13, what that tells me is that the ratings board doesn't think it's scary. Now, I've said this in previous episodes before. I don't think any movie is scary just because I've seen so many horror movies, but as far as like what a general person might consider scary, which I don't know, maybe that means they're startled by jump scares and they're confusing being scared with being startled or what have you, or disturbed or whatever. But it seems that people don't seem to realize that it's more than just like how much blood you're seeing. It's what this arbitrary group of people on the ratings board think is, going to give a 14-year-old nightmares. So by the nature that they're giving it the lower rating means that they are considering it not scary. So it already seems to be, So, but beyond that, Fangoria had this list of movies, and I thought I'd go through it just to pick it apart. Now, before I go into this, I guess I should say something about me, which is that I'm one of the people that is probably more on the restrictive side as far as what classifies as a horror movie. Like, there are people who have a very broad and generous interpretation of what comes under the umbrella of horror. Like, there are a lot of people who would consider, let's say, Jaws and The Silence of the Lambs to be horror movies. I would not. I think there's a stronger case for Silence of the Lambs, but I would consider that more of I think that fits more into thriller, just like a lot of serial killer movies do. Like, if I'm thinking of a serial killer movie that is firmly in horror, I would think Maniac, or I would think Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. But otherwise, other serial killer movies that are a bit more on like the police procedural end and things like that, Seven, those tend to seem more like they're thrillers. But again, these are sort of arbitrary things. I mean, you can consider whatever you want to be whatever genre you want. It's up to you. It's all kind of opinionated, really. In Jaws, just because there's a giant shark, I don't think that's really a horror movie, but whatever. So when I go over these and I say some of them aren't horror, it's just my opinion. I wouldn't group it under that. But you may have a different opinion, and Fangoria certainly roped all of these under horror. So whoever tweeted this out, who works for Fangoria, obviously has a much broader definition. So they had Arachnophobia, which, yes, I would consider Arachnophobia both a horror movie and a good horror movie that is PG-13. So, all right, we're starting that fine. The Birds. So The Birds, I believe The Birds is a PG-13 now, because obviously when it came out, PG-13 didn't exist as a rating, so I believe it was originally PG. I'd probably still call that more of a thriller, but because it's Hitchcock, sometimes some of his thrillers get conflated with horror, so whatever, we'll go with that. Cat's Eye, yes, I would consider Cat's Eye a horror movie. That's an anthology. It's a favorite of mine as a kid. So yeah, good PG-13 horror movie, I would say that. Cloverfield is where I start to disagree. Cloverfield is a giant monster movie, so if you're someone who says if it has a monster it's horror, then I understand that. But I also wouldn't consider Godzilla or King Kong horror movies, and Cloverfield I would say would go into something like that. That it goes into sort of like giant monster movie, there's a little bit of sci-fi in there, but I wouldn't call that horror. And the same thing with 10 Cloverfield Lane. Obviously, that has giant monsters that are aliens, so you could call it sci-fi. But I'd consider that more of like a thriller. It's three people locked in a basement, like a storm dungeon kind of thing, a panic room, shelter. Drag Me to Hell. Yeah, I mean it's a horror comedy, but it does fit firmly into horror. A lot of people like that movie. I'm not one of them. But I understand I'm in the minority there. Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, it has horror elements, but that's pretty much just a flat-out comedy. Like, not even horror comedy. I don't think it's... I mean, there's like a creature that comes out of a pot, and, it has, like, dark themes and everything, but it's a pretty firm comedy. The Exorcism of Emily Rose, I've never seen it, but my understanding is that that's mostly a court procedural. with like flashbacks, and it's about whether this woman is possessed or not. So yeah, it has a demonic possession or a possible demonic possession, but it seems to be more about the court case than anything else. So that's kind of on the fence. Final Girls, yeah, we could call that horror. I actually think that movie would have been a lot better if it were R. Because it is a movie that is sort of a throwback to 80s slasher movies, most of which were R, and it always felt like that one was very watered down, and I don't think that movie's very successful, but a lot of other people like it. Fire in the Sky, it's about alien abductions. It has some freaky scenes, but I'd put that more firmly into science fiction. The Gate it kind of fits in that category of Monster Squad, where it's kind of aimed a little bit too much toward children to be an out-and-out horror, but, whatever. Gremlins 2, the new batch, that's just a flat-out comedy. I mean, yeah, it has, like, monsters in it, but it's a comedy. The Grudge... So The Grudge, I assume they're talking about the American remake as opposed to the original J-horror, just because of the it's not called Ju-on here. I'm going to say the American remakes of J-horror in the early 2000s, I fucking despise almost all of those movies. Even like The Ring, which is very well beloved these days, I think that movie's a piece of shit, and The Grudge is even worse. And a lot of my antipathy toward PG-13 horror movies is that for a large swath of the first part of the 21st century, we were inundated with terrible American J-horror remakes, and they're just all fucking garbage. I am not scared by little contortionist children that meow or have long dark hair, and it's terrible. Eventually, that trend was sort of supplanted by the torture horror once Saw and Hostel came out, and a lot of people don't like those, but I do. And that's sort of what precipitated a lot of the, well, I guess it was a little later when you had the MAGA parody that was like, make horror R-rated again. I mean, there's a lot of R-rated horror being made now, more probably than PG-13. So I think we're sort of past that hump, though there is sort of a fear, and I think some of the backlash to M3gan being edited down to PG-13 was that if it's successful, and it is, if it hasn't turned a profit already, it will in the next few days. But that it will encourage more filmmakers or more studios to cut movies down to PG-13, and that we're going to have this new wave of terrible, horrible PG-13 horror movies that we had during that era. But yeah, but other people like The Grudge. I'm not one of them. The two Happy Death Day movies. So, the first one is definitely a slasher movie. I actually don't like the first one that much. I think it's a little mediocre. It has like some good parts of it, but I don't think it's well executed all around. I actually like the sequel more, but the sequel is firmly science fiction. It is like Back to the Future, alternate universes, time travel. That second one can barely be called a horror movie. That is just full-on science fiction to me. Insidious, a lot of people like it. I do not, but sure, that is horror. Killer Clowns from Outer Space. So a movie that's near and dear to my heart because I have a Killer Clowns from Outer Space tattoo. I have Jumbo on my arm. And I have a lot of Killer Clowns merchandise in my home. But I would not call it a horror movie. It is... Killer Clowns is a comedic homage to 1950s science fiction B movies. So if anything, it's science fiction comedy as opposed to horror comedy. So not going there. Last Exorcism. At quality of that movie, I liked it up until the ending, which I feel is a cop-out, because otherwise the movie is sort of an indictment of religious belief for a while. But The Last Exorcism was a found fiction movie about whether this girl is possessed or not, or whether it's a scam. It's a decent movie up until that ending. I do believe you can probably call it a horror movie, even though for most of it it's more of like a mockumentary that's not even trying to be scary for a lot of it. But yeah, we'll give it to you. Lights Out I never saw. Little Shop of Horrors, again, that's a musical comedy. I know it has a giant talking plant in it, but I think calling that a horror movie is a bit of a stretch. I never saw Mama. Night of the Comet, it's a horror comedy, but sure. The Others, The others, yeah, it has ghosts in it, but it's more of like a supernatural drama, kind of the same as The Sixth Sense. I've never considered, and that's later on this list as well, I've never considered The Sixth Sense to be a horror movie. They're dramas that have ghosts in them. But, sure. And yeah, both the others and Sixth Sense are good. Ouija Origin of Evil, yep, it's PG-13, yep, it's horror. I've never seen it, so I can't speak to quality. A Quiet Place... Yeah, but it's... I feel like that's a fence rider because of the science fiction element to it. It's like post-apocalyptic type stuff. I actually like the sequel more than that original, maybe just because I hate John Krasinski. Already talked about The Ring. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. That movie probably would have been better with an R rating, though. I think that is hampered, but because it's based on books that were popular with children because of the drawings, I understand why they went the direction they did. Split... sure, I would probably put that more in a thriller, but whatever. Tremors is a giant monster. It is a creature feature, but it's also kind of a comedy. And I don't think it's really horror comedy either. I think it's just fully creature feature comedy, but sure. I haven't seen Troll Hunter. That's the found footage giant troll movie. I'd probably put that more in like the King Kong, Godzilla, Cloverfield type place, though. The Visit, aside from The Visit not being a very good movie, probably the most predictable twist of any M. Night Shyamalan movie as well. That's a fence rider for me. It's probably more thriller. The same with The Village. The Village I don't think is a horror movie. What Lies Beneath is not. I think that's probably a Hitchcockian thriller whose trailer ruined it. But I wouldn't call that horror. Warm Bodies, sure. That's like post-apocalyptic zombie romance thing. You're kind of splitting hairs there, though. The Willard remake with Crispin Glover, I'm not sure I'd even call that horror either, even though it's about a guy who can control rats. And then The Woman in Black is a pretty... I've never seen it. I saw the terrible sequel, but that's a pretty standard old English haunted house movie, so sure. So you might have different examples of movies here or different criteria of what these movies are like, whether you consider them more horror than I do. But the thing is, it's a decent selection that they put there. I mean, not all of them are good. There's a couple I really hate there, but fine. But that sort of ignores that there are way more that are terrible. Like, yeah, The Ring and The Grudge were successful, but does anyone remember how many horrible American J-horror remakes there were? From, like, the 3 Pulse movies to 1 hour to, what is it, One Missing Photo or 1 hour? Not 1 Hour Photo. That's a good movie with Robin Williams. There was One Missed Call, and Dark Water, and there was a lot of really bad ones. And I think that's sort of the main gripe, is that there were so many of those. And then from a personal standpoint, back when I worked at the theater, we always dreaded any time a PG-13 horror movie opened because it always just brought out the worst fucking crowds. You basically had a bunch of teenagers that would come on the opening Friday or the Saturday night, and they would just talk and commit a ruckus, and we'd have to give so many refunds to anybody. There was no way that you could go to watch one of those movies and just enjoy them if you wanted to go see them on opening weekend night. It got so bad and so often that my theater actually put in a curfew, which they were very specific as to not call a curfew, that we were only supposed to call it the adult accompaniment policy. But it basically meant that anyone under 18 could not go to any movie alone on a Friday or Saturday night after 5 p.m. I think it was extended to Sunday as well, which caused a lot of kerfuffle with some of the parents as well. But it was the only way to keep it down. And then there was also the issue of the theater that I worked at was located in kind of a rednecky type suburb, so we'd get a lot of fights in front from teenagers who are either, growing up to be shit kickers or, wannabe gangbangers, where, it's like, you're not the next Notorious B.I.G., you're a 14-year-old who can't pass algebra, get a fucking life. So just the fact that it brought out the worst possible audiences on top of being terrible movies, that always left a bad taste in my mouth as well. So there's something to be said for the PG-13 horror movie having its place. Like Michael Kennedy to say, hey, there's a young contingent of growing up horror movie fans, and they probably deserve something that they can go see too, in order to start to get into the world. And certainly when there's people who have kids and they come to me and they're like, hey, I have a kid who's X years old, and they seem to show an interest in horror, but, either I don't want my kid to see boobs for some reason, or I don't want my kid to see too much blood or whatever, or I think some of this stuff might be too scary for them, and what's something I can ease them into. Sometimes I'll give them stuff that is horror adjacent that they can start off with. Ghostbusters, Beetlejuice, some of the stuff that was on that list, Little Shop of Horrors, Killer Clowns. There's some stuff that maybe I wouldn't consider a horror movie, but they're close enough to horror that you can ease them into it. So there is a place for stuff like that. And then, part of me was thinking, well, when I was a kid, I would see actual, R-rated horror movies that were aimed at adults. But then I would think, well, the first time I saw these movies, they weren't the unedited version. They were usually the edited for TV, and they were shown on either Joe Bob's Briggs Monster Vision or TNT or Sci-Fi Channel or USA Network or one of those stations. So when I complain about M3gan being edited down from R to PG-13, I mean, a lot of the times that I was first introduced to, Nightmare on Elm Street or something, or Halloween, they were the TV equivalent of PG-13 because they were edited down to be shown on television with commercials. So there's something to be said for that. But there's also something to be said for the adult horror movie fan who, let's say you love the theater experience, and if you're listening to me and you watch my videos and stuff, you might be someone like that too. So you love the theater experience, and the problem is, the R-rated or unrated, however they end up releasing it, cut of M3gan exists. They will put it out. It'll be on physical or streaming or both or whatever, and people who have seen the PG-13 version might want to check that version out if they also liked the original, or they also liked the theatrical, rather. But if you love the theater experience, it sucks that you can't experience the fullest version of the movie in theaters. And it was kind of... I had a similar feeling to Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. When Eyes Wide Shut was first released in theaters in the United States, they put these digital figures in front of some of the sex that was going on in the big orgy scene in order to avoid an NC-17 rating. And they only did this in the US. They didn't do this in the UK. They didn't do this in a lot of Europe places. So it was if you live in one of those countries, you can see Kubrick's full vision unedited, but if you live in the United States, you go to theaters and you have to see this basically vandalized version of the movie. And then later on, I've owned Eyes Wide Shut twice on DVD. Once the first DVD release, where it was still the edited version or the censored version that was in theaters. And then I got it in a Stanley Kubrick box set that had Eyes Wide Shut, Full Metal Jacket, 2001, and Clockwork Orange in it. And it wasn't advertised anywhere, and it still had the R rating listed on the package, but the DVD had the uncut version, and that was the first time I saw the fully uncut orgy scene, and at that point I was like, what's the big deal? This isn't anything worse than you'd see in, Wild Orchid or 9.5 Weeks back in the 80s. So, but it just sucks that, yeah, we can see the full version of this movie at home, but if you love the theatrical experience, it sucks that I can't see the full version in theaters. I have to see this censored, tainted version of it in theaters. And so that's sad, but I sort of understand. So there's the idea of, does the PG-13 movie, or does the PG-13 rating hurt the quality of the movie as it stands? And for M3gan, you can read my review on Letterboxd for my full feelings of it. But essentially, the bottom line is, I liked the movie, and I liked it more than I expected to, because it has a really good human element about sort of grief and childhood trauma and stuff. But I basically had two major issues with the film that kept me from more than liking it. And the reaction to the movie is kind of the same. I have the same complaint about it as I have with a lot of movies these days, or at least a lot of the discourse around movies, especially on the internet, which is that anytime a movie comes out, it seems like you can only either passionately love it or furiously hate it. It seems like there's no room in the discourse for people who are just like, I liked it, that was a good movie, It was not a great movie, but it was better than mediocre. This is a good movie. On a scale of A+ to F, it is a B. And to me, most movies fit into that. Most movies are good. They're not great, they're not mediocre, and they're not terrible. And M3gan fits there. It is good. It borders on very good, but it still seems to just stay at good for me. But it seems like everybody else who's seeing it, they either are claiming it's like, oh, this is like the first great movie of 2023. It's like, it's not a great movie. I mean, it's good. It's better than I expected from the marketing. But it's not great. But, you know, if you like it, Slay Queen, it's all you. But the two things that were holding it back for me, one is that the plot is just derivative, but I kind of expected that part going in. I mean, there's only so many ways you can do a killer doll movie, unless they like went super artsy and made it Ex Machina. And the other is that I do feel like the PG-13 does actually affect the quality of the movie, that it does hold it back. Because now, M3gan is marketed as a horror movie. It's being considered a horror movie. I think it fits more into science fiction than horror myself. Also, the body count is fairly low in this theatrical version. I think only like 4 people die. Supposedly, in the uncut version, the body count is higher, so I assume there's characters in the theatrical that died in the original version. There's 2 specifically I can think of that probably did. But we know that it cuts away from the kills too quickly, and it doesn't go as bonkers as it could, given the funny nature the intentionally funny nature of a lot of the movie. And we know from at least the trailer, there's minor spoiler here. There's a character who gets killed near an elevator, and their blood splashes on another character. And the trailer shows the blood splashing on that character, and in the theatrical cut, there's no more blood anymore. They're stabbed. It's bloodless. I don't know if this was a reshoot or if they just digitally erased the blood, but it's a very clear difference between what we saw in the trailer and what's in the finished film. And so that was definitely done for the PG-13, and I do think in this case that hampers the film. As well as a couple of the other kills, they are, you know, they eventually cut away or they're completely off screen, and I think it would have been for the film's benefit to actually show them. It's not one of those, you know, it's better to leave it unseen type thing. I don't think it works like that for this one. So, but your miles may vary. You may think it works perfectly fine. So it's sort of that. I don't like the idea. I guess my main issue when it comes to M3gan itself, because I still think the theatrical film is perfectly fine. It's a good movie as it exists right now. I do think that a eventual R unrated cut might actually improve the quality of the movie for me to a point where I might change its star rating on Letterboxd that I gave it. But for other movies, it might terribly hamper them, where, you know, there are a lot of movies that have gotten released with less than an R rating, and we'll never get to see what the R-rated version looks like. One of my favorite examples is Dan Aykroyd's Nothing But Trouble, a comedy that sort of borders on horror at some points. Most people hate the movie, but I have a special affinity for it. But it was originally going to be an R-rated movie called Vulcanvania, and they changed the title, and they cut it down to a PG-13, and as far as I know, the footage of the R-rated version is completely lost. So even when Shout Factory put out this great new Blu-ray of it last year, it didn't have any like deleted scenes like that or anything, so it's gone. I mean, this is a problem even R-rated films have if the MPAA cut out too much gore and everything. Friday the 13th Part 7 comes to mind. It's just, if a movie is going to be created in one way, I want to see what that original vision is like. I mean, even if it's not a ratings issue, I mean, the whole release the Snyder Cut thing was the idea of we want to see the original vision or somewhat version because he added extra shit later. But we want to see the creative thrust behind this original vision. I mean, I'm not a fan of Zack Snyder, and I'm not a fan of either version of Justice League, but I'm glad that we got to see what the actual intended product was and not some sort of studio Frankenstein version of it. And so I'm always sort of pulling for that. Now, M3gan is already financially successful. They are definitely going to make a sequel. I think that's already been announced, I think. So it remains to be seen, are they going to make a sequel and they're going to start from from Jump Street that it's going to be PG-13, in which case we're talking about something different then, because we're not judging it as an edited or mutilated piece of work. We're just judging it the way it was conceived and created. Or are they going to say, like, okay, we know we can make money PG-13. In 2 years, there might be a 15-year-old who's now 17 and can see this alone. Will we steer into the skid and just release an R-rated sequel to it? Because sometimes movies and their sequels have different ratings. I mean, usually it steps down. Like RoboCop 3 is PG-13, the other two are R, and things like that. But sometimes, Lawnmower Man as well. Lawnmower Man was R, Lawnmower Man 2 is PG-13. Trying to think of an example that starts off lower and gets to an R. I'm sure there's one, but it escapes me at the time. My guess is they'll probably stay with PG-13. But more of what I'm afraid of is that it's going to set a precedent where, because movies are having a hard time marketing, and the marketing thing is a whole other conversation. I could do a complete other episode about it. But because marketing being what it is and how difficult it is, that we're going to start seeing more PG-13 horror movies being made. And just, in general, PG-13 horror movies, more often than not, are terrible. Like, yes, we might get a very good PG-13 horror movie, as some of Fangorias List was. We may get the next Arachnophobia. Well, I think they're rebooting Arachnophobia anyway, but you know what I mean. But more of the time, we're probably going to get The Forest or something terrible that no one remembers anymore. So I worry about that, because right now, I mean, we're coming off of 2022, which was one of the best years for horror in recent memory. And, you know, we're getting a lot of the artsy A24 movies. We're getting some good stuff coming out of studios. Even bad stuff that we're getting out of studios, like Smile. I fucking hated Smile. A lot of people loved it. I hated it. Smile is a movie that would have absolutely been PG-13 10 or 15 years ago, but was released with an R. They were starting to just give R-rated movies to even shit that would have been PG-13. I mean, Truth or Dare, which had the same stupid smiley face thing, that was released as PG-13. I think that may have also been originally R, actually. That movie was fucking terrible, but the PG-13 helped it make a profit. But I'm afraid that we're going to get more of this. I mean, Blumhouse has straddled the fence here. Like, they've released stuff that is very much R, your Purge movies, stuff like that. But they also released some really shitty PG-13 horror movies, like that Fantasy Island movie that came out right before COVID. They've done some pretty terrible work in the PG-13 sphere. So, I think that was PG-13. So, let's not encourage them to do more stuff like that. I don't want to see this, like, horror renaissance that we've started to get end up just reducing to PG-13, especially because we've seen, I think Dan Murrell had a metric that came out that most of the most profitable movies, basically the gross of these movies compared to what their budget was for 2022, I think 4 out of the top 5 were all horror. You saw stuff like Terrifier 2, which is as far away from PG-13 as you can get as far as gore. But stuff like The Black Phone. The Black Phone is a movie that probably would have been PG-13 all day 15 years ago, but was released with an R and did well. And I'm afraid that they're going to edit movies like that down to PG-13 now that they know it's like, hey, you know, this might cushion our bottom line by $20 million extra as opposed to releasing it R. And we're just going to get a slew of shitty PG-13 horror movies again like we did in the early 2000s. So that's my fear. What I'm hoping, beyond that fear, is that they'll see that movies that are horror movies that are firmly within the R space are still making money, and that they don't need to do that, and that M3gan might be a one-off because not every horror movie is going to have a protagonist with a TikTok dance that can be easily marketable to tweens. So it remains to be seen, but that is my fear. But look, I've babbled about this for a little bit. Let me know what you think. Do you think PG-13 horror movies are worse more often than they're better? Are there PG-13 horror movies that you really like? Are you afraid of more PG-13 horror movies, or do you welcome them? Do you want to defend The Ring and The Grudge? By all means, you can try. Or are you in the opposite? Are you in my camp? Are you in my camp that most horror movies should be R, and that at least R gives them a bit of a leg up? Because I'll tell you one thing. If Smile had been released with a PG-13, it probably would have been one of my worst films of the year. Like, the only thing that kept that from being in my, like, bottom 5 was the balls of the dead animal and some of the creature effects at the end. Otherwise, I fucking despise that movie. So sometimes the R rating can be a saving grace. It can bump a bad movie to just a mediocre one, or a mediocre one to a good one, in my opinion. But let me know what you think, because there are a lot of very feisty, divisive opinions you can have about this topic. But I am firmly in the camp of we probably shouldn't have PG-13 horror movies at all unless they are conceived from the get-go to appeal to a teenage or child audience. And I don't mean movies like The Forest or The Ring, which by all other accounts look and sound and feel like they should be R-rated and feel held back. I'm talking The Monster Squad. I'm talking movies that are very much aimed at a younger audience. I'm talking about like a harder-edged version of Goosebumps. So, or like if they ever made a theatrical Are You Afraid of the Dark movie or something like that. But anyway, thank you for joining me and listening to me ramble about this particular topic. Again, I'm interested in hearing everyone's different opinions about this, as well as, M3gan's stands, because I like the movie, but it seems like a lot of people loved it a lot more than I did. And I hope you have a good one, everybody. So stay safe, watch some horror movies.